This is United States History 201, Presentation 10, the United States Constitution. So in the last presentation, we talked about the Articles of Confederation, some of the perceived problems with the Articles, and I mentioned by discussing the Mount Vernon Conference and then the Annapolis Convention that there was going to be a call for a new convention in Philadelphia in May of 1787. And this becomes the Philadelphia Convention, or sometimes known as the Constitutional Convention of 1787. So, why not the Constitutional Convention? Well, I think that's a misnomer, because it wasn't certain we were going to be writing a new Constitution in May of 1787 when these 12 states met. In fact, this was simply going to be a discussion of the problems under the Articles of Confederation, and most delegates believed that all they were simply going to do is discuss ways to amend the Articles. So we've only called it the Constitutional Convention because the Constitution eventually was written there. But at the time, it was the Philadelphia Convention, and it met from 14 May 1787 to 17 September 1787. There were 55 delegates from 12 states. Rhode Island did not send a delegation. And the meeting was held in secrecy, ostensibly because nobody really wanted to know what was going on there. They weren't even sure if this was legal, in fact, because under the Articles of Confederation, that's not the way you change it, by meeting a convention like this. Now, there were important members, James Madison of Virginia, George Mason of Virginia, Edmund Randolph of Virginia, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, Oliver Ellsworth of Connecticut, John Dickinson of Delaware, Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, Robert Yates of New York, Alexander Hamilton of New York, William Richardson Davie of North Carolina, Hugh Williamson of North Carolina, Gouverneur Morris of Pennsylvania, Robert Morris of Pennsylvania, James Wilson of Pennsylvania, and John Rutledge of South Carolina. These were the principal actors at the convention. And, of course, George Washington was also there. He was elected president of the convention, and as was Benjamin Franklin, who was from Pennsylvania. Now, essentially, what we have is the perception that at the convention, or following the convention, you had Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Well, this is wrong. In fact, Patrick Henry said you had rats and anti-rats. So essentially, so did Elbridge Gerry. But essentially, the two sides at this convention were the Nationalists, led by Madison, James Wilson, Gouverneur Morris, and Hamilton, and the Federalists, who they wanted to maintain the federal government found in the Articles of Confederation. These are people like Elbridge Gerry, John Rutledge, John Dickinson, Roger Sherman, George Mason, Robert Yates. So it wasn't really large states and small states. It was Nationalists against Federalists. And of course, I mentioned George Washington's elected president of the convention. Benjamin Franklin was there to lend weight to the proceedings. The Virginia Plan, written by Madison, proposed by Randolph, is going to set the stage for this this convention. And so as soon as the Virginia delegation gets there and all the other delegations are filing in, Edmund Randolph will propose the Virginia Plan, written by Madison. This has been in the works, though, for months. Madison and Hamilton had already been concocting a scheme to do this for months. And so the Virginia Plan was a nationalist framework. It called for a bicameral national legislature. Representation was based on population of both the lower and upper chamber. The executive would have been elected by the legislature. The judiciary would have been chosen by the legislature. So you have three branches of government. But it was a complete overhaul of the central government, and it was designed to centralize authority. So why? Well, this is often called the large state plan because Virginia was a large state, but essentially Madison believed the states were causing all kinds of problems. They needed to centralize power and essentially eliminate the states. And so by having a national legislature, what you would do is just create kind of these divisions, these legislative divisions. Really didn't matter about state. And so the idea was to create one government that was all important. Madison was continually checked in Virginia by people like Patrick Henry. He thought Patrick Henry was a problem. He thought people like Governor Clinton in New York was a problem, or people like John Hancock in Massachusetts. They were problems because they wielded a lot of power in their state, and they blocked, at times, activities by the central authority. So he thought we should get rid of this by nationalizing everything. The problem was the states had been the central feature of the American governmental system, even before they were states, when they were still colonies, going back to the 1750s. We talked about this with the Albany Plan of Union. I mean, of course, the charters. All these, we're looking at culture. All these states were distinct and independent. All the cultures were very distinct. So going to a national framework just didn't make any sense. There wasn't an American nation. And so people bristled at this almost right away. Now, Charles Pinckney of South Carolina presented another plan called Pinckney's Plan. And in the preamble to this plan, he had we the people of the states of, and he listed all the states. In fact, much of the language of Pinckney's Plan has found its way into the final draft of the Constitution. Pinckney's Plan created a much stronger central government, but the states were still at the center of the document. It didn't create a national government. So the question is, at this point, what type of general government would the United States have? Would it be a national government or would it be a federal government? And basically what happens is the proponents of the document swear that it's still going to be a federal government, where the states have the primary interest in this document. The states are the building blocks of it. But what happens over time is people say it's a national government. Well, it can't be both. Now, people would say there are federal and national features of the government because you have the Senate, which is the federal feature, and the House of Representatives, which is the national feature. But still, even in the House, the states are primary. So that argument kind of falls apart on its own merit. Gouverneur Morris of Pennsylvania said, the distinction between a federal and a national supreme government, the former being a mere compact resting on the good faith of the parties, the later having complete and compulsive operation. And the government today does not have a complete and compulsive operation. So it's not a national government. It still is resting on the good faith of the parties. If the United States Constitution maintained the federal compact of the Articles of Confederation, and it did, then submission to the Constitution is done in good faith and not compulsion. That's the idea. Now, eventually, there will be some debate about this new plan and what was going to happen, but eventually William Paterson of New Jersey would present what's often called the Small State Plan. This is a series of amendments to the Articles of Confederation, and his argument was that the delegates to the Philadelphia Convention had no authority to scrap the Articles of Confederation. So it gave the general government more power. The general government could tax and regulate trade. It created a plural executive without a veto. This is a very interesting concept. And it had created a judicial branch. The interesting thing about Paterson's plan is that it was actually in some ways more nationalistic than Madison's plan because it had compulsory obedience to the central authority. They could compel, through force basically, the states to comply. That's not in the Constitution. So the current Constitution is still a federal plan. Now, John Dickinson at this point said, well, wait a second here. We're running off into innovations. He said, experience must be our only guide. Reason may mislead us. We don't want to do this. Now, Dickinson was a moderate against the innovations that the Nationalists were pursuing, and he insisted on maintaining the federal elements of the Articles of Confederation while strengthening the general government. He didn't want to run off the rails, so to speak, and go out to something they don't know what they were doing. So this idea that we've had a federal system actually predates the Articles of Confederation. The British system, the British constitutional relationship between the colonies and London itself was kind of a federal system. So this is what they were looking at here. So what happens then is something called the Connecticut Compromise. It's not really a compromise between large and small states. It's a compromise between a national and federal plan of government. Roger Sherman, this is a quote, urged the equality of the votes, not so as much as security for the small states as for the state governments, which could not be preserved unless they were represented and had a negative in the general government. That was the idea. The Senate would be the negative in the general government. Now, what were the innovations that people like Dickinson were talking about? Well, Hamilton had some. He wanted an American king, senators for life, strong central government, the abolition of the states. James Wilson supported every proposal to render the states powerless in the general government. Gouverneur Morris generally supported every nationalist proposal and thought states should be compelled to support the general government. These things did not find their way into the Constitution. So when people start talking about the Constitution to compel the states, it's ridiculous. Because they were rejected at the Philadelphia Convention and then rejected in the ratifying conventions. Now, there would be several compromises. There will be some compromises on slavery, even though the word slave is not in the document. But the Three-Fifths Compromise said that slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a person towards representation in Congress. Now, this was a compromise because Southerners wanted to count them as a whole person towards representation because they feared what the North would do if they could run roughshod over the South. Northerners said you can't do that because they're chattel. Now, Northerners were fine as counting them as a whole person towards taxation. So what we get is a 3/5 compromise. It didn't say slaves are 3/5 of a person. It just said that slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a person towards representation. Also, the international slave trade was cut at 1808. Now, a lot of Southerners wanted to get rid of the international slave trade, but Northerners were fine with keeping it going because they made money off of it. Term lengths for president and Congress were openly discussed. I mean, some very funny things went around, and actually there were some mock proposals because they wanted to show how ridiculous it was to think of senators for life and presidents for life and all these things. But eventually you get 4-year term for president, 2-year term for a member of the House, and 6-year term for a senator. The taxing power was tied to the apportionment of representatives, so this is why that issue of slavery became so important. And the important thing is that what we're going to get is a general government for the general purposes of the Union. That didn't mean the minutia of the state governments and all the internal affairs of the states and the general government of what the people are doing in the states, but for the general ideas of the Union. Commerce and defense, that's basically it. Now, there are several clauses in the Constitution, and I urge you to go out and read the Constitution. There's the General Welfare Clause, which is often misused. The general welfare of the Union, the general government for general purposes, commerce and defense. The Commerce Clause is often misused. Congress could regulate interstate commerce and also commerce of foreign nations. Does that mean they couldn't regulate the commerce in internal commerce, intrastate commerce? They couldn't do that. And individuals were not considered commerce. This is trade policies. What they wanted to do was make a free trade zone in North America, so states weren't passing tariffs against each other. The Necessary and Proper Clause was argued that this thing was going to unreasonably enlarge the powers of the government, and it was called the Sweeping Clause. And so the proponents of the document swore that wouldn't happen, but of course it has happened. The Supremacy Clause was argued that this was a problem because it said that all legislation made in pursuance of the Constitution, all treaties made, were supreme law of the land. So people were worried about this, but again, it was argued that only constitutional items are supreme. Anything else is not binding. What we get, though, is a reduction of the Constitution to a series of clauses. This clause, that clause, etc., etc. Now, the September 17th, 1787 is the day the Constitution was approved in Philadelphia, but it was nothing more than a scrap of paper at that point. It had not yet been ratified. George Mason of Virginia said he would rather cut off his right hand than sign it. There was no Bill of Rights. The representative ratio people thought was wrong. It took 9 states to ratify it, and voting was by state in convention. It was a constitution between the states, so ratifying the same, not between people, but between states. So what kind of government are we going to have? Is this going to be a federal constitution or a national constitution? Madison was actually forced to defend a document he did not want in May because this is a federal constitution. What branch had the most power? Obviously the Congress. Of course, some of the other issues were power of the states vis-a-vis the general government. What about judicial review? That's not in the Constitution. What about executive powers? Very vague and undefined in many ways. So all this stuff is going to be debated when it goes to the states for ratification. So again, this idea of Federalists and Anti-Federalists is a little distorted view of the ratification process. The Constitution needed the states to give it life and validity. Federalists actually stole the name and did a remarkable sales job for the new document. They were the Nationalists. The Anti-Federalists were really the Federalists. And they pushed for assurances that the Federal Republic would be maintained and there would be a Bill of Rights to protect both the states and the individual from this new government. So, let's talk about some of the important states here: Pennsylvania, New York, Virginia, Massachusetts, North Carolina, and Connecticut. Some of the things that happened in each one of these states. So, Pennsylvania was the second state to ratify the Constitution, but really it was the opening bell, regardless of Delaware, which was the first state to ratify the Constitution. There was a tremendous amount of violence and intimidation here, and so the guys who were against it were trying to hide out so they wouldn't have to go and sit in the convention, so they didn't have a quorum, so people were physically brought to their seats. And if you couldn't get it done in Pennsylvania, get it through the Constitution. That was the idea. Now, James Wilson, he's called the Caledonia because this is a slap at his haughty nature, but he gives a very famous speech almost right after the Constitution is signed in the State House yard of Philadelphia, where he said that anything that, first of all, the states still have all the power. If the Constitution doesn't authorize the general government to do it, it can't do it. And that became the basis of the argument for the proponents of the document as it moves forward. There was a very strong but ignored anti-Constitution group in the western part of the state, and they're ignored because the pro-Constitution men control the process and prevent the publication of opposition remarks. So this is what I'm saying. There's violence, intimidation, there's censorship. The two most important dissenter groups were a group of people called the Dissent of the Minority, and they wrote this very long treatise about why the Constitution was dangerous, and another individual named an old Whig. Nobody really knows who that is, but he wrote some great tracts against the Constitution. But you get a large victory for the Constitution, though a deceptive one, 46-23. Probably should have been closer if the pro-Constitution group didn't control the convention and the voting. Connecticut ratified the Constitution on January 9, 1788. There were very interesting remarks by Oliver Ellsworth, who wrote as the landholder, and Roger Sherman, who wrote as the countryman, and Oliver Wolcott Sr., who was a very important individual in the state of Connecticut. Opponents of the document were intimidated and browbeaten. This is actually where we get the term from, browbeaten. They were denied even publishing their comments against it in the press, and they were demonized, vilified as being these anti-American people, and so at the time they called this being browbeaten. Ellsworth argued that, again, the Constitution could only do what the Constitution said. You couldn't go outside the document, and the states were still primary. In fact, Ellsworth himself supported the secession of New England later on. And so when he thought the Constitution was running off the rails and was doing things that he didn't think it should do. So New Englanders openly talked about this. In Massachusetts, opponents of the Constitution had the upper hand, at least initially. People like Sam Adams and John Hancock and Elbridge Gerry opposed the document. And those are very powerful forces. They talked about a number of things in Massachusetts. Representation, they thought that they should have had one-year terms instead of two. The powers of the central government they thought were too many. They were too open-ended. And slavery was discussed. A lot of people in Massachusetts were uncomfortable with a union with slaveholders. They demanded a Bill of Rights. And John Hancock eventually supported the document at the end of the convention because of a promise for a Bill of Rights. So with his support, the Constitution will be ratified in Massachusetts on February 6, 1788. You can see they're very close, 187 to 168. Virginia had the great debate. On one side, you had people like Patrick Henry, George Mason, and William Grayson, who were opposed to the document. On the other side, you had James Madison, Edmund Randolph, George Nicholas, and Edmund Pendleton. They supported it, and this convention is loaded with great speeches, great one-liners. George Mason had a funny one, and one of the proponents of the document said that George Mason had lost his wits, and because he's old. And when George Mason heard this, he said that, well, sir, when you lose yours, no one will even notice. This kind of stuff happened all the time. And most importantly, the insistence that the Constitution reinforced the Federal Republic and did not establish a national government. That was what people got out of this the proponents of the document. That's what they swore the Constitution meant. Henry actually said he smelled a rat when he entered the convention. It was ratified conditionally on June 25th, 1788 by only 10 votes. And the Virginia ratification included a resumption clause. If the Constitution went off the rails, Virginia said it could resume its independent status, which is secession. New York was thought to be the deciding state when its convention began, but of course, eventually another state ratified, so it wasn't. But people like Robert Lansing and Robert Yates, Abraham Yates, Mellington Smith, and George Clinton opposed the document. Alexander Hamilton and John Jay supported it. And this is where you get the Federalist essays or the Federalist papers. Hamilton Jay and James Madison were writing these essays in New York newspapers trying to get people to support the Constitution. Even though they did all this work, it only passed by 3 votes because there was insistence on amendments for a Bill of Rights. Hamilton was actually shown to be a liar during the convention. He wrote the Yates, Lansing, actually, I should say, kept a journal. And when Hamilton was talking about all these things that he had said in the convention, that he had said opposite to in the Philadelphia Convention, he was called to the carpet and, of course, exposed as a liar. North Carolina was the first state to reject ratification. It was often called a postponement. But there were 2 ratifying conventions, and one from July to August 1788 called the Hillsborough Convention, then one November 1789. So the question is, what was the status of a state out of the Union? It wasn't in the Union because it rejected the Constitution. The government had already met, and North Carolina wasn't represented. Wiley Jones was the most conspicuous opponent of the document, and you had 2 very powerful forces in support of it, William Richardson Davie and James I. Riddell, who later became a Supreme Court justice. Davie actually founded the University of North Carolina. They supported the document, and their statements again said, well, if the Constitution doesn't say you can do it, the government can't do it. And if they do something that's outside of their delegated powers, then you don't have to follow that law. This was the American tradition. So in summary, almost every state had a proposed 10th Amendment. Only was typically first on the list. So eventually you're going to get the Bill of Rights, which prohibited the prohibition on the general government only. It was ratified finally in 1791. And all proposals for the Bill of Rights were aimed at preventing the usurpation of sovereignty either from the people or the states by the new, more powerful central authority. The Ninth Amendment actually is interesting. It was put in the document because there was an argument against the Bill of Rights that said, well, if we have a Bill of Rights, then it's things we don't list, the government will just think they can do. So the Ninth Amendment was supposed to be that catch-all amendment. Just because we didn't list it doesn't mean you can do it. So the question is, at the end of this, were the antis right? The antis had said the government will become abusive, presidents will become like kings, the government will run roughshod over the text, they won't really care what it says. I think if you look at it objectively, that's happened. All their prophecies have come to fruition, and that's not a badge of honor. That was if that had happened, if they'd known this would happen, they never would have ratified the document. So really this is a great sales job. The proponents of the document swore up and down it would never be abused, and it has been over time. Okay, so that's the last presentation for Quiz 2, and I'll pick up with the next one for Quiz 3 material next time. See you then.